Hey, Stockholm. Right. Hey is about the limit of my Swedish, so I'm going to stop there. It's nice to be here in lovely Sweden again. Such lovely cherry trees and everything. But I'll tell you, there was another reason I was looking forward to leaving home. Because, you know, in Oakland, California, where I live, we have big, mean squirrels. I wanted to get away from them. They tease the cats, they throw nuts at people, and it turns out they chew through phone lines. I didn't know this until I started having problems with my internet service and my home phone. They kept going in and out. So I went to my service provider, AT&T, and I looked at their support page thinking, all right, I'm going to call somebody, get a technician out here. And I get my internet service and my voice from AT&T. It's on the same line, plugs into the same hole in the wall, comes on the same bill. So maybe you see my problem here. Where do I go? I'm not sure. Which one do I look at? I don't know. Different phone support numbers. I picked one. I called them up. I said, hey, can you get somebody out here? They said, sure, I'll send you a phone technician. So phone technician shows up, fiddles around with the wires, scratches his head. Guess what? You need the internet technician. All right. Call up again. Can you send me an internet technician? No problem. The internet technician comes out, pokes at some wires. You're guessing this, right? He says, you need the phone guy. Okay. Third time's the charm, right? I call up one of the phone numbers because I couldn't call both. And I said, hey, could you possibly send me the internet guy and the phone guy at the same time? And the woman on the other line says, I'm sorry, ma'am, my system won't let me do that. Meanwhile, I'm looking up the competitor's pricing, trying to figure out what that's going to cost. I took a deep breath, very politely said, okay, are you in the same building as the other people are? She said, yeah. I said, do you think you could walk across the hall and talk to the other people and schedule them together that way? She thought for a minute, dead silence on the phone. Oh, I guess I could do that. It had never occurred to her before, clearly. All right, well, why does this happen? Happens all the time. We've all had customer experiences like this, right, where there's just no common sense. And you think the human race is doomed. What are we going to do? Well, it doesn't happen because people are stupid, really. It happens for a lot of reasons. One of the big reasons I talked with some of you about last year is values. If that employee isn't taught that the company values customer experience more than, say, a certain policy or procedure, that's going to affect the customer's experience. We all experience values at work when people say, oh, we don't have the time to invest in user research or testing or design, when clearly we have the money to invest in other things. So really it's about what you value, not about what you have money for. It also is based on how we work. So we all work in teams, right? And those teams are related to other teams in an organizational chart. And those organizational charts tend to work like what we call silos in the US. I don't know if you guys use that word here, but you know how grain silos are stacked up next to each other, but they don't communicate? Well, organizations do the same thing. There's the mobile team over here, there's the web team, maybe there's even the checkout team, who knows what it is. But the gaps between those teams show up in the user experience because our user experience really spans more than one of those silos. You touch more than one team's work in the course of actually experiencing a product or a service. Okay, my battery range clearly doesn't work. But we also impose some of this thinking on ourselves. It's not just about the org chart. We think about design as, oh, I'm designing this feature. Or if you're in an agile team, I'm designing this user story. And that way of thinking is very narrow, and it constrains how we think about things. So how many of you guys have seen a user story that looks something like, as a user, I want to log in? Hey, what should I do this weekend? I don't know, I think I might log in. How about you? said no human ever. It doesn't work that way. This is why we get broken little features. This is why when I sit down to use web conferencing software, somebody I can tell was assigned to design the login feature. Because I type my password wrong, and it says, guess what, you're locked out for 5 minutes. I have a meeting to go to. Somebody's not thinking about what happens after you log in, because they're designing the login feature. So we do this to ourselves in a way. So a lot of you out there are probably saying, yep, our team understands this. And that's why we started doing journey maps. Awesome. It's a great starting point. The idea behind a journey map is basically, let's look across all the silos. A lot of teams will say, let's look at all our touch points with our users and think about how they flow from one to the next. Great. Now, the average journey map that I see, well, if you do a Google image search on journey map, you get something like this. Pretty deliverables. As Greg was saying, it's not about the deliverable. These really polished artifacts are going to look awesome in somebody's portfolio. But a lot of them I don't think are helping their teams as much as they could, because they're not necessarily helping them have the right conversations. In fact, what goes in a journey map seems to be really variable depending on who you talk to. Pretty much the only commonality you tend to see is that there's some sort of flow involved. So I'd like to propose a different approach. In my experience, teams that are using journey maps well are doing 3 things. They're helping find the problems. They structure the journey map in a way that makes the problems visible. They're doing something that helps the team see how to fix the problems. And they're helping the team do one better than that and identify new opportunities and figure out how do we actually deliver something that's unexpectedly good. So we have to look beyond our touch points. And by the way, that's kind of a creepy word. We don't really touch our users. They don't want to be touched. We don't know them well enough to touch them. We have to go beyond just our touch points, which is basically, hey, people use these products and services of ours, and here's how they flow through them. Because a real user experience isn't like that. In reality, that user's journey probably starts before they touch one of our touch points, maybe ends beyond our last touch point, and they might actually go off and use somebody else's tool partway through their journey. It's not all ours. It's not all about us, which I know is a sort of a novel thing to most teams. So how do we do this? Well, first question is to say, how does an actual user describe this process? Forget our touch points. How do they think about it? So you go out and you talk to a user. Let's imagine that we are the team at an airline, and we're trying to design the airline's customer touch points. And let's say one of our target users is Karen, who is a frequent flyer. Well, if we sit down with Karen and we ask her, what's a business trip look like for you? She's going to describe it something like this. She's going to say, first I book a flight, then I book a hotel, maybe I book a rental car or a train ticket after that. If it's international, I might have to get a visa or something. Then, as the trip gets pretty close, I pack, I figure out how to get to the airport, get through security, and after I check in, I board the plane. I fly, sit on the plane for a while, then I get my luggage, get to the hotel, lather, rinse, repeat, and eventually I do my expense report, because in her mind, that business trip isn't over until her expenses are all processed. That's part of the package. So if we're the airline, we can tell this is pretty different from the idea of just our touch points. There's obviously some stuff in here that we don't own. There's other people's parts of the experience, like the taxi is obviously not our thing, but it's part of her journey. It's part of how she sees the world, so we have to figure out how do we integrate with that to some extent. So the way that we spot the problems is we start to ask, how do you do those things? That list of 13 sticky notes we just put up on the wall. How do you actually go about those? What tools do you use? What tasks do you perform? And so what you're trying to come out with is, for each of the stages in that journey, who does she talk to? What information does she consume? What other tools does she use? So, for example, for booking a flight, Karen starts out at a site called Hipmunk. Anybody used Hipmunk? It's a lot of fun. My personal favorite is that it sorts flights by agony. Best filter criterion ever. So she almost always flies United Airlines, But she looks at Him Monk anyway because it gives her a visual display and she can see, oh, how long is the layover, and she can sort by agony, so that's pretty cool. Then she picks a flight and goes to United, because it's a United flight, starts to book it there, and says, okay, what seats are available, because I want a good seat. And then she sees what's available, and she goes over to seatguru.com, because that's a review of all the seats, and she can see, this one is tricky, it doesn't have leg room, or actually, this one's next to the bathroom, no, thank you. She figures out what's good, she goes back to United, books her seat, finishes her transaction there, and she goes and enters the flights in her calendar as appointments, sends the itinerary once she gets it in email on to other people who need that information. So if we're the design team at United, we can already see she's using other people's tools for quite a few things. There's definitely wasted effort here, and it's not all centered on us. But we can't do much about that effort yet until we know why she's doing those things. So that's the next part of our journey map. What is she trying to achieve? What's she trying to understand? What information is she using to make a decision? And how is she trying to feel? What is it she wants out of the emotional part of that experience? So what she wants most is to get a comfortable flight and seat combination at a reasonable price, but really comfort is key. She wants to know about flight times, layovers. She wants to know which seats are decent based on different criteria she has in mind. And she wants to feel confident that she's going to have a comfortable flight. Well, if you look at the reality, that's our meter of how well we're doing. So we say, how do you feel now about this process? And she says, yeah, I feel pretty smart and confident. I'm going to have a decent flight, but it's kind of annoying. It takes a while. So what we're trying to do is at each stage of the journey, we're digging into what are people doing in what sequence? What are they trying to accomplish? What are they trying to understand? What information are they using? How would they like to feel? And how do they feel about it today? And that gives us a lot of clues. Now, you'll notice this is a pretty ugly artifact. That's because if we take our teammates out to do user research with us, people from other disciplines, so they get to know the users instead of just believing what we tell them, and they get to know it viscerally, well, they can help us create this journey map, co-create it with us, and then they'll believe in the way that we need to improve the journey. Right? So it's a shared artifact. And it's not designery and intimidating. It's ugly and something we can put on a whiteboard with some Post-it notes. And that's intentional. And then together we can start to talk about how do we create a better experience. So we can start to do scenarios. We can start to do the kind of storyboards that Greg showed you. We can start to imagine the future story. I'm not going to talk about that. You all know how to do that. But here's the thing. When Johan invited me, he said, Kim, can you talk about service design and how we take that step and turn our practice into that? Well, in service design, we can't just think about that website. We have to think about all the other processes and tools that surround it. We have to look at what's under the covers, so to speak, the hidden parts of the system. And those hidden parts of the system tend to be internal processes, internal tools, values, culture, hiring, incentives, all kinds of things like that we have to start examining. So our user research is going to point us to the problem spots, but then we have to investigate inside the company to understand what's causing some of those problem spots. So if we go back to my friends at AT&T, well, clearly their scheduling tool is a problem because it doesn't have visibility into the whole organization. So there's an IT project right there. The org chart might be a problem because you have these two very separate organizations that might not share budgets or incentives, so they don't necessarily have a good reason to work together. And we need to work on the culture. The fact that it didn't occur to the call center agent to walk across the hall and talk to somebody in order to solve a customer's problem, that's a cultural thing that needs work. We need to get people to take the initiative around customer service. So, also it would help if they fix the squirrel problem. Population control would be nice. Probably a little much to ask of AT&T. But here's the thing. We have to understand this whole journey in order to change it. We have to get a shared understanding on the team, get people to recognize, here's who we're designing for, here's what their problems are, here's all the other tools they're using, here's our opportunities. So this is a good small step we can take toward changing the organization. And we've got to understand the internal tools as well. But when we start trying to change the internal processes and tools, boy, if you think changing a website is hard, just wait. Culture change tends to be bigger than your average design project. It's at least a 3 to 5 year effort. That's assuming you've got executive buy-in, that someone has said, yeah, this is a good idea, make it so. And the reason it takes so long is because, well, you have a lot of people who are worried about change. You've got old habits to break. People aren't really clear on the change you're asking them to make. So you've got to do a lot of work to actually deliberately plan change, kind of like you would a design project. It's a design problem. Now, we tend to get frustrated with how things move slowly in our organizations. And we say, you know, they need to change their level of investment, they need to change their attitude. But what are we doing besides complaining about it? Are we actually approaching that in a conscious, planned way as we would a design project? When you sit down and do a design project, you think about, okay, well, I need to interview this many users. It's going to take me this long to do some initial sketches and get some feedback. Then it's going to take me this long to do the more production level work. We know how that, we know our plan of attack for that design problem. Do you have a plan of attack for organizational change? Most teams don't. And we need to sit down and deliberately say, what do we need to change and how are we going to go about that if we're going to be successful? Because that's arguably much more important than any page you're going to design on a website or any form you're going to design in a product. So we have to master the methods of change. We have to understand how that process is different from our design process. Actually, I think we're well equipped in a lot of ways. We know how to take a big complex project, a big complex vision, chop it up into smaller projects and execute on those. We're good at that. We're good at vision. We're also good at multidisciplinary teams, and change is a multidisciplinary effort with a lot of different roles. Change starts with an evangelist. We're probably pretty good at that right now. We're used to talking about this. Change requires what Lawrence and Dick call an autocrat. In other words, somebody who actually has the authority to say, make it so. We're not going to make real change without that happening at some point. Then it requires some system design, processes, templates, evaluation systems. How do we hire people for the right set of values? That all has to happen too, because those tools dictate how people behave to some extent. And then we need a role called an educator, storytelling. People who start to reinforce what the values of the organization are. So we have to master that process. And finally, I think we have to use a skill that we're actually pretty good at. This is one reason I think designers make good change leaders, is change is an emotional thing. And to most of us, change is loss. That's how we hear it when we're asked to change. We grieve when we're asked to change. We grieve for what we see as our autonomy, our creativity, our authority in an organization, our status. We grieve for just a familiar, known, comfortable system. And so rather than getting frustrated with our colleagues at their resistance to change, we can choose to approach those conversations differently. We can instead listen deeply, as we know how to do. And imagine they're our users, because they are the users of the design process in a way. And we can try to understand what are their goals and what are their emotional needs. And am I meeting those as a colleague? And that's how we make change. It's by connecting deeply with our colleagues as we do with our users. Thanks for listening, and good luck with your change. It's a long journey, but it's worth it.
Please hurry now with your questions, your tweets, if you want to ask Kim something. Kim, what you're talking about is actually management. It's leadership. Is the UX business bad or good at that?
It's a good question. I would actually distinguish management and leadership. Management is an operational responsibility that's assigned to you. Leadership is something other people assign to you based on how they see your behavior.
Agree.
It's an earned role, not a title. And so I think that's a thing we have to be good at, because creating good user experiences requires bringing a really diverse set of people together. It requires changing values. It requires coordination. And that's not a thing you learn in design school. That's not about pixels, that's not about plastic, that's not even about the interaction with the product. That's about understanding how our colleagues think and making the case for why change benefits them.
But do we attract that kind of people to our businesses?
You mean to the design world?
Yeah. The managers?
I think design leaders often grow reluctantly. I think a lot of people come into design because they like creating artifacts.
Right.
They like creating beautiful journey maps. I mean, who in this room doesn't get satisfaction out of creating a beautiful thing? Yeah. We like the tangible. And learning to get satisfaction from, say, a teachable moment with someone, at the end of the day feeling like I didn't create anything, but I changed a mind. That's a different kind of satisfaction that I think we have to look for.
Yeah. Annika, do you have anything?
Does client find it frightening when you question large part of their way of doing business? And if so, how do you cope with that?
Terrifying. They find it terrifying. I think anytime you challenge the status quo, people feel threatened, or they think, you're a designer. Why on earth are you asking us how we do business, or why? One of the things that I do often with an organization when I go in to help them make change is, I say, hey, I'd like to interview the human resources leaders. And they're like, human resources? Aren't you about helping us change our products? Yeah, I want to know how you hire people and how you incentivize them and what you evaluate. Expect what you inspect is the phrase. So people do find it challenging, and you can't necessarily come in the door and start with that as what you're going to do. I think you have to gradually introduce the idea if you're in-house. As a consultant, I think you can occasionally get hired to do that, but it's a long, long road.
Do you have even more, Annika?
No.
No?
Okay.
Thanks. How was the workshop yesterday?
I don't know, guys. How was the workshop?
Very good.
Right.
Was it?
Yeah, I think it was.
What were the major things you discussed there?
Major things we discussed. Well, we did a sort of a longer version of this journey mapping work.
Yeah, I heard a little.
And people got to sketching storyboards and so on. And we actually tackled some healthcare problems. Somebody wanted to change the laws of Sweden. I said, hey, I'm all for abundance thinking.
And what about your position at Patients Like Me?
Mm-hmm.
How does that project go forward? How are you doing there?
So I spend about 80% of my time at Patients Like Me. Right now, the team is growing gangbusters and taking on some work with the product team as well, trying to grow that. And yeah, the company is getting into new areas, going to start integrating clinicians into the workflow and that sort of thing. So moving beyond just patients, trying to really change healthcare as a whole system. So that's fun.
Is it do you see effects of it? Do you see that others copy the idea, or that it's
yes.
sort of an influence from it?
Yeah, there's a ton of people doing patient-centered things now. There's a lot of different websites and apps that are trying to collect patient data. I mean, you've got HealthKit on the iPhone right now, trying to let patients enroll in clinical trials right there. So that's all good. Any way we can give patients a voice is great.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Kim
you.
Goodwin. Thank you.